Here is Van Dieman's Midnight Sky, a black shimmering ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
Now, this is a beautiful, deep, dark black with little to no tone variation by paper and never any shading, making the dark, bold lines on the page really crisp to look at. Now, in non-fountain pen friendly paper, though it sometimes isn't as dark, but this isn't always the case, just with the cheaper papers. So it can lighten a little bit under bad circumstances. The pen for today is an Aurora Optima Mia Sol with a broad nib.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Something to be noted is I did not rotate and agitate the pen as it sat for 2 days before I did the writing sample, so it's my mistake. So the shimmer's not really going to be coming through these writing samples. Now, what we get here is nice, dark, bold lines with no feather, no spread, no tone variation, performing exactly the way we want black ink to look. Great on the page. Just wish I hadn't messed up in dealing with the shimmer. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have a well-performing ink. Can easily continue our notes back here.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Van Dieman's Devil's Kitchen. Here is Van Dieman's Devil's Black. Here is Van Dieman's Freyanet Aquamarine. Here is Van Dieman's Tasmanian Saffron. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the tone on the page, we have just as dark, the same black as it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feather, no spread, no shading, just great performance. Now, as a note, had the shimmer really been coming through, then we probably wouldn't have seen it on this paper because it is a bit more absorbent. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have no problem continuing our fancy notes back here with the shimmery ink.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we have the same dark black that we had on the Clairfontaine, but unfortunately, we do have feathering. Them fled. Them on the first line, fled right in the middle on the second line, into on the third line. There's some feathering going on. Not a ton, but it is there. And I've chosen this paper because it tends to do better with fountain pen inks, and it's just not doing as well. It's not really holding up. There's no spread that's going on. There is no shading. So if you can overlook the bit of feathering that's going on, then it could be a good match for you. It's just not going to be a good match for me. Looking at the back of the page, we can see why there was some feathering as the ink got very deep into the papers, and it really does correspond with where the feather went on. Now, with that, I don't, as far as being able to write back here, not this ink, just because this does not seem to be the best match. In general, different ink, I think you could. I wouldn't. I would avoid this paper with this ink.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
We have the same dark, black, crisp lines that we had on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade, doesn't have a problem standing out from the quad rule. Also, on this paper, sometimes the ink gets cut by some of those vertical lines. It does not do that. It shows that this is really very opaque, very strong and together, not being separated by it there being printing previously on the page. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, continue those happy, sparkly notes.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Diatramentis Artist Ink Black. Here is Krishna Empty. Here is Mont Blanc Mystery Black. Here is Platinum Black.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
It's going to be important to notice, and I'm just going to put it out now, that when you get to the end and it's on the yellow paper, though it's not coming through on camera very well, the shimmer is coming through strongly in that, and it still winds up looking good. But we're here with this paper, where it is slightly lighter a black than it was on the Clairfontaine. Only slighter, really. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade. Just does what a black ink should. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem, all smiles.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Syra. Here is Private Reserve Shell Pink.
Here is Montagrappa Harry Potter Hufflepuff. Here is Diplomat Burgundy.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we have a slightly lighter a slightly lighter black than it was on the Clairfontaine. I don't know why I said gray. It's feathering a little bit. Not horribly, but it is there. There is a little bit of spread, not horribly. It is there. I think it's a serviceable situation, what's going on, that if it was not a broad nib, it would be much nicer to look at. But the broads in this paper don't go together well. It's not going to stop me from using broad nibs because I do like them. Looking at the back of the page, you could see that you could not continue writing your notes back here because of how deep into the paper this ink got. However, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Aurora Optima has a wet broad nib and shows a great dark line with crisp edges, no shading. Now, I did try to ruin the experience by using a very dry, fine nib, but the ink is just too powerful. It consistently gave dark, bold lines with no shading, making its performance perfect as a black ink. So all that can be said is ink up your favorite pen with this regardless of its nib and flow, and you won't be let down. This is a dealer's choice.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.